Okay, everybody, can I ask everybody to return to your chairs so that we can get the next session underway? We've got a really exciting session coming up, so I really want to maximise the time that we've all got for some Q&A at the end, hopefully. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Justin Douglas. I'm the Chief Economist with the Department of Home Affairs in the Australian Government, and we'll start the session just acknowledging the first people that were custodians of this land. And now, this session is on the topic of data innovation, and data innovation is really important in this space. Migration, the reason for that is that migration's not one thing, but it's actually the sum of thousands of individual decisions by thousands of people moving. And as we're going to cover today, it's people moving not just internationally, but also around a country. And it's people moving temporarily or permanently, and it's the employers and the communities that fare well and welcome them. Understanding this richness is key to good policy design, a well-informed public and political debate. And in this session, we're going to hear about 3 data sets that are helping to counter myths and deliver facts in this space. The first speaker that we'll hear from today is going to cover what is migration, what do we mean by it, how do we measure it, especially after COVID, something that I, in my job, spend a lot of time needing to ponder. We'll also hear about some really exciting new work that's being done joining data sets in ways that just wasn't possible even just a handful of years ago. So data integration, as it's known, is also something that we'll hopefully have time to cover. The second speaker will actually illustrate some profound insights that we're getting out of one of those integrated data sets when Dr. Varela is going to cover some issues there. And finally, we're going to hear about some social data and that's been coming out of the work that James has been doing. So first of all, I'll welcome Beta Cho. She's Director of Demography at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. She's been there since 2004 and in her current role since 2012. And currently leading some innovative data integration projects to support evidence-based policy development. Please welcome Beta.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks everyone for having me here, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting on today as well. So, as Justin has pointed out, I'm from the ABS, and today I'm going to talk to you about some data innovations in our population statistics program. And in particular, I'm going to have a focus on net overseas migration statistics, net interstate migration statistics, and also, if I get a chance, I will also talk to you about some integrated data sets that we've been working on recently. So as Justin mentioned, I'm the Director of the Demography section at the ABS. So our area produces quarterly population estimates, and the net overseas migration component is a key component of the population change, and also net interstate migration is also really important as for states and territories, the state and territory level population is what they use for their planning and policy purposes. So let me start on the net interstate migration, which I will shorten to NOM from now on. So just before I start on talking about the innovations, I just wanted to cover the concept of a NOM. This is our official NOM estimate method for Australia. So we use what we call a 12 out of 16 month rule. So this is based on the UN definition that to be a resident in a country, you have to have spent 12 months in the country, and to be considered out of scope for the current population, you have to be out of the population for 12 months. And we operationalized this particular definition using 12 out of 16 months, and this allows for people to have short visits overseas without compromising their residential status. So if we use a 12 out of a 16-month rule, for you to be able to get the actual accurate estimate of NOM, you'd have to wait 16 months to see whether people are going to come back or to determine whether people stayed. Now, we know 16 months is a long time for policy and planning purposes, and in order to balance the need for data sooner versus, I guess, the accuracy of the data, we produce what we call preliminary NOM. So this NOM is produced 6 months after a reference period, and this is the number that most people use for their planning and policy purposes. So number is published quarterly, but it is 6 months out from the actual reference quarter that you're measuring. So this preliminary NOM is the statistic that I'm going to now talk about, and the recent innovations that the ABS has undertaken to improve the preliminary NOM estimate. So I just outlined the 4 key innovations that we've had in recent years, and then I'll show you a graph which I guess illustrates how the innovations are performing against the previous model. So, so the data that we use to calculate NOM numbers are the border crossing data that we get from Home Affairs. So in the past, we used to have outgoing passenger cards and incoming passenger cards. So we relied a lot on these passenger cards to determine who was in and out of the country at any given time. So in 2018, the outgoing passenger card was abolished, which made it necessary for us to work out how else we might be able to calculate the preliminary NOM. And at this point, we sought a lot of additional information from Home Affairs and also other administrative data sources to give us the data that we need to continue to calculate preliminary NOM. The next innovation I'm going to talk to you about follows the COVID-19 pandemic, when we needed to have this data that we produce. Prior to 2020, we were only revising once before it became final. So we produced it at the 6-month mark, we would revise it at the 12-month mark, and then by the 18-month mark, it was final. So it underwent one revision between preliminary and final NOM. But during COVID, there was a need for more frequent data and also more frequent revisions. So we introduced more frequent quarterly revisions. So that was another innovation that we took to the preliminary NOM. And also, during the COVID, our preliminary NOM relies on determining propensities from a very like traveler from 1 year ago. So this is how we determine preliminary NOM, is when you don't have the final migration outcome of a person, you model that person's potential outcome using a donor from 1 year ago. So during COVID, the donor from 1 year ago is not really going to be reflective of the people who were traveling during COVID. So we changed the propensities, but now that we've come out of COVID and we've resumed travel at pre-COVID levels, we've had to change the propensity again. But I'll go into a bit more detail in my following slides. So I guess this is the main slide, which shows the performance of each of our NOM improvements. So the closer the blue and green lines are to each other, that shows that the preliminary NOM is performing really well when compared to when the data is finally finalized. So from 2006, we call it a preliminary norm from 2 years ago. So we pretty much used a donor from 2 years ago. So if you were traveling, but we didn't quite know whether you were going to be a resident or going to be or exiting the population. But we would try to determine that by using a similar person's migration outcome from 2 years ago. So that would be the model norm. So at the time, this was kind of like a new model, and we thought it was performing quite well. So in that first section, you could see the 2 years ago model. The preliminary is the blue line, and the final is the green line, and you can see the gap between them. It's a little bit big compared to what how we've improved it in the future, but at the time, we thought that was performing really well. And then there was a need to try to improve that model. So instead of using a donor from 2 years ago, we thought, okay, we'll try to use a donor from just 1 year ago, and that might be a better reflection of how a person's migration outcome might be finalized. So we used the 1 year ago model for quite a number of years. And as you can see, it's tracking really well. In times of economic stability, in times of travel stability, this 1 year ago model works really well. And then we improved that further by not doing just an approximate 1 year ago, but a true 1 year ago. So it was the people who travel at exactly a year in time prior to when you traveled. And so that performed really well, and we were really, really happy with this 1 year ago model. But then COVID happened, and this is what happened to all the traveler information that we were using to model that 1 year ago model. So what went from a really, really nice synchronized prelim to final NIM, prelim norm to final norm, we had this disruption in the number of people traveling. And those people who were traveling during COVID had very different migration outcomes than to people who were traveling before COVID. So people who traveled during COVID were traveling with an intent to either become a resident or exit the country for good. So it was very different to the migration outcomes of people who were traveling prior to COVID. So what we say, this big plummet in overseas travel, we had to then revise the way we do our preliminary norm again, because the 1 year ago propensity would not have worked. It was just not reflective of the people who were traveling at the time of COVID. Here, you can see in a bit more detail the visa categories and the migration outcome. So you can see the stability prior to COVID, that peak with all the disruptions during the COVID period, where the migration outcomes, like I said, the people who were traveling during that time were more likely to become a resident. And then you can see that it's normalizing at the moment, not quite back to pre-COVID times, but normalizing. So we really had to think about how we calculated our preliminary norm. So this is just a summary of the previous slide. So like I said, much smaller volumes of travelers during COVID. The migration ratio was just not reflective of people who were traveling during pre-pandemic times. So we shifted the donor group again during this time. So instead of using a 1 year ago propensity, we used a 2018 based propensity. So we used what we thought was a normal period for us to use that was not affected by the COVID travel. So on a quarterly basis, we were always monitoring whether this was the right propensity to be using, whether we needed to shift the model again, or whether the preliminary versus the revised versus the final norm was performing well. So this was quite a task, because we were heading into an unknown, but we had to ensure that the preliminary norm for the ABS was the best available statistic that we can produce. And because a lot of planning happens on our NOM numbers, we really had to ensure that whatever we did do with our model had to maintain a certain level of data quality and also had to maintain a time series as well, because for users, it just wouldn't make sense to be breaking a time series because we were changing our method. Okay, so at the moment, we've reverted back to the true 1 year ago model. We feel like the travel volumes have picked up. There's been a lot of, I guess, discussion about whether there's been a very, very high migration numbers coming through at the moment. So at the moment, what we're trying to determine is to make sure that our prelim NOM, in terms of the propensity, is really still the best propensity to use for this current time. 3 minutes. I'm now going to just touch on NIM, and this is net interstate migration. And I want to touch on NIM because this NIM sets the population numbers for the states at the state and territory level. And the one thing that I wanted to mention was that at the moment, the previous census showed that the ABS didn't do so well in terms of determining state and territory level population in between censuses. And this is because at census time, we get a really good read on the Australian population, and between censuses, we've been using Medicare administrative data to determine the flows between the states. So what the most recent census showed is that in between censuses, our Medicare data is not capturing all the interstate movements. And we feel that this is because a lot of recent migrants are moving within Australia, but they don't have a Medicare record for us to use to determine their movement levels. So what we're proposing to do at the ABS is to review net interstate migration for the first time using the PLIDA, which is the Person Level Integrated Data Asset. And the key graph I want to show here is that in the past, until now, we've been using Medicare data to determine flows between the states, and that's the green shaded area under the graph. But if we use PLIDA, we would also get into the data that is available to us, tax data and social security data. And that will help us determine interstate migration flows a lot better than just using the Medicare data alone. The black line there is the census line, so that's the line that we're trying to reach with the admin data. I was going to touch on a few integrated data sets that we have, but I might leave it there in the interest of time because I know our next speaker will be talking about integrated data sets. Thank you.
Thank you, Beta. Our next speaker is Dr. Peter Varela. Peter is a research fellow at the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute at the Crawford School of Public Policy here at ANU. Peter has previously worked at the Australian Treasury and the Productivity Commission. He holds a PhD in economics from ANU and has been a visiting researcher at a long list of institutions. I'll save some time. He is currently working on a major piece of work informing the current review of Australia's points-based migration system. Peter, welcome to the stage.
Okay, thanks Justin, and thanks Alan for the opportunity to present today. I will, worked it out. Okay, so today we are going to look at some results from an ongoing project that I'm doing with Professor Robert Brunig at the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute. This work is funded by the Australian Centre for Population. We have a few CPOP members in the audience here today, so thank you for that ongoing collaboration. Part of this project is going to be looking at skills downgrading, but in general, we want to be thinking about why PLIDA is such a great data asset for this type of exercise, what some of the things that it allows us to do that you weren't able to do previously, but also the sort of challenges that come with using these new data sets and why we have to sort of move a little bit slowly, rush slowly, if you will, when we use these data assets. Okay, so firstly, what is skills downgrading? This is the idea that migrants come to Australia and work in a lower skilled occupation than they are qualified to work in. The presentation from this morning, the example that we have in our head is doctors driving taxis, and the presentation this morning usefully sort of set me up with that by introducing that idea. What we want to do is see how well we can measure this using the PLIDA data set, and in particular, we are going to be comparing the occupation that people say that they're going to be working in on their visa applications and comparing that to the occupation that they work in Australia. Now, this is slightly different to the standard measure of skills downgrading, which compares academic university qualifications with occupation. So this is something that we can do with this data set that is not possible with a lot of other data sets. So this is done using PLIDA, the person-level integrated data asset. For people who've heard of PLIDA, it's fantastic, and you can spend hours talking about this. For people who haven't heard of PLIDA before, essentially this is the ABS's linkage together of administrative data sets. So we link together tax records, DSS, social security records, various health records, lots of admin data sets. But importantly for our purposes, they link together the visa grants data set. So we can have a look at all of the visa grants in Australia and compare those to their tax returns in the years following migration. And that's what we are going to do today. This is a applied presentation, so I need a little bit more about the data we used. We are looking only at primary points-tested visa holders, so this is the Skilled Independent program. And we are going to use all data for all visa applications from 2012-13 onwards. So the big reform at that point, it makes comparing the previous programs a little bit tricky. The data looks a little bit different. So we're just going to drop those earlier years and look at the last 12 years. One more very quick intro. We are going to be comparing occupations that people say they're going to work in with those that they work in. We need to have a way to measure occupations. In the sort of data sets that we use, and also in the visa system in general, occupations are defined using these 6-digit ANSCO codes. Basically, every occupation has a 6-digit code. When you apply for a visa, you say that you are working for this particular occupation that has a 6-digit code next to it. Two specific things that we want to know for this presentation. First, these occupations are nested. So similar occupations sit next to each other in the codes. They have the same starting digits. I am going to be saying that people work in their nominated occupation if they match at the 4-digit level. So this allows registered nurses aged care and to work as registered nurses psychiatric care, and that would still be considered working in the same occupation. This is important with empirical work, because once we get into this, we're going to see some of the things that can happen. The other thing that we just need to know, there are high-skilled jobs and there are low-skilled jobs that are defined using this ANSCO framework. And what we're going to do is we're going to see people who said that they were going to work in this occupation. Did they work at a different job, but also at a similar skill level, or did they work at a different job at a lower skill level? Because that's quite important to the interpretation. Okay, so this is what it looks like. We have 6 lines here. The first line is matching at the 4-digit category. So again, this is the average share of migrants for all of the skilled primary migrants in PLIDA. We have about 30% of people who match at a 4-digit level. We have 20 to 30% of people that are at a different job at the same skill level. We have 20% of migrants that are employed at a lower skill level, so this is the sort of downskilling. We also see a large number of people, 10 to 15%, that don't list an occupation on their tax return. The outcomes of this group, the average earnings of this group, suggest that this is also a form of downskilling. That the sort of average earnings of this group are sort of a similar amount to the downskilling population, which means that when you're doing these data exercises, you can't treat this group as missing at random. We also see a small amount of upskilling, and we see about 2 to 3% of people that just don't show up in the records at all. They're in the country, but they're not showing up in the tax return data. Now, this is, again, the power of PLIDA to do this type of analysis. What we are going to do here is we are going to look at each 6-digit occupation. I've picked 6 occupations here just to sort of get a sense of what this data looks like. We are going to do a decomposition where we say, what share of migrants match at the 4-digit level, and then how much do they get paid? What share of migrants work at a lower skilled level, at a different job at the same skill level, and how much does that hurt their earnings in Australia? And we'll continue across the table, but if you look at that first row, 32% of accountants work as an accountant after migration to Australia, and when they do, they earn 18% more than the typical Australian at the same age. 15% work at a different job at the same skill level, 35% work at a lower skill level. So that's a relatively large amount of downskilling amongst the accountants group. We see different numbers. We see for registered nurses that we have a much higher proportion of people that work in the occupation that they nominated on their visa application. Beyond the general power of PLIDA to sort of do these decompositions, 2 things to point out. The ability to match into your occupation varies a lot across the occupations, and this makes sense. The ability to apply your skills from one country to another will depend on the specific occupational institutions, the specific skills accreditations that you have in each occupation. The other thing we see is that there's not really a penalty to working in a different occupation at the same skill level. There is a large penalty for working at a different occupation at a lower skill level. And we also see a large penalty for no listed occupation. I have a regression equation, I'm sorry. This formalizes the finding that I just said. Basically, we want to have a finding that says the penalty for working at a lower skill level is about 30%. The penalty for working at a different job at the same skill level is much, much smaller. It's about 2.5%, and regressions are good for making this type of generalized statement. Another thing we might be interested in, the top 10 occupations amongst downgraders, skill downgraders. So where do people work if they're not working in their nominated occupation? This is just the list of the 10 highest occupations that we observe, along with the relative income amongst these groups. And we see here, we see variation in the relative income. We see some occupations that may be downskilling, or they may just be people putting something onto their tax return data. Remember that this is self-reported occupation data, so it's possible that program or project administrator is not actually true downskilling. This is, again, some of the value of using this data, but also some of the challenges of using this and working through the issues with the data. So this is the sort of thing that you wouldn't see if you were just running regressions at a high level. The last main result that I want to show you today compares the matching rates with the average incomes in the skilled migration program. So this is, again, skilled independent points tested migration program. What we do here is we compare the incomes of these occupations with the share of migrants who end up working in these occupations after being granted a visa. What we see is that there is a very strong positive relationship that people who nominate a higher income occupation, nominate to be a doctor, for instance, nominate to be lawyers, engineers, are much more likely to work in those occupations after arriving in Australia. People who nominate low-income occupations, and there aren't too many low-income occupations in this program, but the ones that do are much less likely to actually work in that occupation after arrival in Australia or after their visa grant. This is really important. For policy, there is an ongoing question. Do we target human capital? Do we target average labour market outcomes? Or do we target skill shortages and target sort of labour market sort of shortages. What this is saying is that if you use this program to target low-income jobs that people aren't working in, migrants won't work there either. Migrants will leave and work in a different job. This, in some sense, is incredibly informative, but it is also the type of thing that you get when you do initial research. And it's the sort of thing that when you come across this type of thing, we need to sort of work through over time to understand what's going on. This is part of the trade-off of using Platter. So where to from here? This is just my closing slide. We have looked at how to measure skills downgrading using Platter. We've also estimated the impact of skills downgrading on migrant earnings. What we actually want to know is whether we can do something to reduce skills downgrading. This is not something that you can directly observe in a data set. Even if you have 100% data, you're asking a counterfactual policy question. So as much as it's good to get to this point and understand the dynamics, the next step is to start to think through, we have some ideas about why downgrading happens, we have some ideas about when it might be stronger and when it might be weaker. The next step is testing it using this Platter framework. And this is hopefully what we will be talking about over the next 12 to 24 months. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Peter. And our final speaker this session is Dr. James O'Donnell. He is a lecturer at ANU's School of Demography. His research focuses on social cohesion within neighbourhoods, housing, homelessness, labour markets and demographic changes. He's leading the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute's Mapping Social Cohesion study, and James's address is going to cover some of these social cohesion challenges in Australia and that data set. Please welcome Dr. O'Donnell.
Thanks, Justin. Got that right? Fantastic. Okay, what is happening in the world today? If you were to look at the news and the media, you'd believe that societies around the world are incredibly fractured and divided, as if societies are in some way falling apart. The number of pictures you can find that I found doing a quick Google of streets literally on fire is quite astonishing. And we know that immigration and attitudes towards migration and ethnic and cultural religious divisions and differences are front and centre, particularly across UK, Europe and North America. From riots in the UK to protests, counter-protests and divided elections across Europe, and the prominence and divisiveness of immigration in the US election and the election before that and the election before that. Now, for every anti-migrant action, there seems to be a much larger reaction in terms of counter-protests and demonstrations. Still, the sheer divisiveness of debate and discourse around immigration and intercultural harmony in this particular epoch stands as a critical social issue in the world today. In Australia too, some pressure points, major political parties have come to a consensus that immigration is too high and must be reduced, perhaps at least on the case of the government's position to ward off an anti-migrant backlash at home. Aside from that, we had a difficult and divisive debate over the voice to Parliament last year, the stabbing of a Christian church leader and a community backlash in Western Sydney, and adding to financial and cost of living pressures and its social ramifications, as well as community backlash against violence and particularly violence against women over the last year. The Mapping Social Cohesion study, tracking attitudes and experiences, is its key function, particularly within multicultural Australia, informing the community and policymakers on how Australia is faring on these issues. It's become a public record of who we are and how we connect with each other. So it's a major study of social cohesion and attitudes to immigration and other topical issues in Australia. It's been running since 2007 with annual reports every year since 2009. The centrepiece of the study is an annual nationally representative survey of Australia to gauge their attitudes, perceptions and behaviours related to social cohesion. The study was led since its inception by Professor Andrew Marcus and the Scanlon Foundation. Andrew retired in about 2022, and at that time stewardship of the study transitioned to the ANU, but we're certainly standing on the shoulders of his incredible body of work. By way of example, the 2023 survey had more than 7,500 people completing a survey. We had 7,500 people completing the survey through the Social Research Centre's Life in Australia panel. This is a mostly online survey, though 2 to 3% of people can complete the survey by telephone. In 2023, and trying to do this again, and trying to do this again this year, we had a targeted survey to try and boost the number of respondents who have migrated to Australia from different parts of the world. And last year we were concentrating on Africa, India and the Middle East, recognising as that area is one where we want to strengthen our representativeness of. The main survey is only done in English, but in these boost surveys, participants could choose one of 4 languages. The survey contained more than 90 questions related to social cohesion and more than 28 demographic and socio-economic indicators. And over the last few years, a common feature of the study has been a qualitative component, particularly where we do in-depth interviews to delve deeper into the experiences of life in Australia. As its name suggests, the study is principally concerned with measuring and tracking social cohesion, but in an unapologetically broad, holistic, inclusive and multi-dimensional way. So in measuring social cohesion across 5 domains, we capture the social and psychological well-being of individuals and communities, from their sense of belonging and identity, their subjective and financial well-being, their social justice, their active participation in the social and civic life of their communities, and the acceptance and support for our differences and diversity. In so doing, we measure not just social cohesion, but personal and collective well-being, attitudes to migration, migrant integration, and the key drivers of those. The ability of the study to speak to both the attitudes and behaviours of society at large and the specific experiences of migrant Australians has been greatly enhanced in recent years through the growing number of migrants interviewed through both the main survey on Life in Australia and through the boost surveys and qualitative interviews. Just on Life in Australia, we had more than 2,000 migrant Australians complete the survey in 2023. So to demonstrate the value of the study in informing our understanding of these issues and to get into the spirit of the day, let's see some of the ways the study can tell us about some myths or facts, some propositions that we might argue for and against. Let's go the big one first up. Is Australia a racist country? Well, Australians have very high symbolic support for migration and multiculturalism. About 90% of people agree that multiculturalism has been good for Australia. Similar proportions say that we shouldn't be rejecting immigrants on the basis of their backgrounds. 85% think that immigrants improve Australian society by bringing new ideas and cultures. And about 7 in 10 think we should be doing more to learn about customs and heritage of different groups in the country. But on the other hand, prejudice and discrimination is still common. Around 1 in 6 people say they experienced discrimination in the last 12 months based on their skin colour, ethnic origin or religion. And that was 37% of people from non-English speaking backgrounds. 6 in 10 hold a negative attitude towards migrants born in India, China, Ethiopia, Lebanon, Iraq and or Sudan. Around about a quarter of people hold a negative attitude towards Muslims, and 16% hold a negative attitudes towards Christians. 6 in 10 believe that racism is a fairly or very big problem in Australia. Although, there's still work in progress on this one, but with our larger samples and boost samples, we are able to say more as well about the specific experiences of different migrant groups, where, for example, we're estimating that more than 40% of Chinese, Indian, African and Middle Eastern respondents experienced discrimination in the prior 12 months, although appear equally likely as the Australian-born population to believe racism is a fairly or very big problem in Australia. So is Australia a racist country? It's a big question. There's no simple answers. Yeah, but there are some strengths too. Myth number 2, amidst COVID-19, Trump, right-wing populism, protests and riots, etc., anti-migrant sentiment in Australia has exploded, or at least increased. Well, on those symbolic indicators of migration and multiculturalism that I showed before, there's actually been improvement. So the proportion that believe multiculturalism has been good for Australia increased from 77% in 2018 to 89% in 2023. Similar increase for the proportion that don't think we should be rejecting migrants based on their race or ethnicity. And an increase in those who believe immigrants improve Australian society by bringing new ideas and cultures. And an increase also in those that think we should be doing more to learn about different customs and heritage. And on that attitudes to Muslims question, so as I say, in 2023, we had 27% of people saying they had a very or somewhat negative attitudes towards Muslims, but this has at least become less common over time. So just in 2019, about 40% of people said they had a negative attitude toward Muslims. So is anti-migrant sentiment getting worse? At least not yet. Number 3, that hasn't shown up very well, but number 3 is migrants aren't integrating and not adopting Australian values. Well, with the survey, we can measure lots about how different indicators of social integration develop and change over time. So how migrants are making friends across their different cultural divides, how they're involved in their communities, and how much they feel a sense of belonging and connection within their neighbourhoods in Australia generally. A sense of belonging, for example, increases over time the longer people have lived here and the more they have built social roots and connections in their communities. So there's a score on belonging, as in to say the sense of belonging that people have, and in this case migrants have, in their neighbourhoods and in Australia. And this increases over time irrespective of socioeconomic factors like education. The experience of discrimination, though, appears damaging to these trajectories of belonging. So delays in integration come at least as much from external factors, and particularly discrimination, as they do, and social injustices and inequalities. Just as an example, Muslim respondents are much more exposed to discrimination than other migrants. So on the left-hand side, we're predicting the extent to which Muslims from educated backgrounds experience discrimination over time and comparing that to people who are not religious and those that are Christian. So much more likely to experience discrimination in Australia. But on the right-hand side, they also have a higher sense of belonging in their neighbourhoods and communities. So there's the higher levels of discrimination, but also higher levels of belonging. So their faith doesn't necessarily block integration. Rather, their community engagement through religion, this is something that came up particularly through the qualitative interviews, their engagement through religion appears to aid social integration in many senses and their sense of belonging in Australia, at least relative to non-religious migrants. So do migrants integrate? Well, it's a big and complex question, but migrants, as in people, are diverse and have diverse experiences and motivations. But we certainly see that, at least on average, psychosocial integration increases over time. So the fourth one hasn't shown up well, but migration and migrant diversity are bad for social cohesion. Well, for the last couple of years, and this is from 2023, the Social Research Centre produced estimates of social cohesion by local government areas. And these were published in the Australian Cohesion Index last year. And what the results showed is that belonging, worth and participation were lower in the most migrant-rich and linguistically diverse of communities. In the case of belonging and participation, this is partly the result of time and time in the integration process. So the most diverse communities are also home to the most recently arrived, those who are still building their social roots and connections, temporary workers, students, as well as those potentially stuck on temporary visas and those that, of course, always intend leaving home after their studies and temporary work. The lower sense of worth derives from greater financial stress in some diverse communities. So while migrants overall have strong economic outcomes, The most diverse communities are also where there is a greater concentration of socioeconomic disadvantage. And socioeconomic disadvantage is by far the stronger influence on social cohesion. So across all of our measures, socioeconomic disadvantage, financial stress is detrimental to our sense of connection, our sense of belonging, our sense of worth, our sense of social justice in society, as well as our acceptance of migrants and diversity. And so that speaks to economic inequalities in diverse communities that then can be compounded by social inequalities, including as witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic, when diverse and disadvantaged communities were among the hardest hit by infections, deaths, employment and policing, and less likely to access supports or have those supports accessible to them, like JobKeeper, and also experiencing a slower vaccination rollout. So we can look at some of the potential then social ramifications with the Mapping Social Cohesion Survey, where we can see that trust in government spiked for the Australian-born, that's the line in orange, and also for migrants from non-English speaking backgrounds, the ones in black. But the spike was much more evident for those Australian-born people. And we can do this for a range of different indicators and get similar results, where migrant social outcomes weren't nearly as positive as they were for the Australian-born. So overall, we're reporting a sort of almost a galvanising effect from the pandemic in the way that we came together. We trusted and appreciate government measures to protect our health and well-being, and we were more connected with each other, particularly within our neighbourhoods. But that was much more the case for the Australian-born. So is migration and diversity bad for social cohesion? Well, not migration and diversity per se, but social and economic inequalities in diverse and disadvantaged communities certainly appear detrimental. So these are all propositions and questions for debate. They're more complex than the sort of indicators that I've shown here. There are mostly no black and white answers, but the Mapping Social Cohesion study can inform thinking in rich and varied ways on these and many other questions. Here are some resources. There's the Mapping Social Cohesion reports, the Australian Cohesion Index, both published on the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute's website. There's a Social Cohesion Compass, which I haven't been involved with, but I've played around with a bit. A really cool visualisation tool, so you can look at especially some of the geographic indicators within communities. And then if you really want to get your hands dirty, the individual confidentialised unit record data from the Mapping Social Cohesion data is published in the Australian Data Archive. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. We've just got a few minutes for a couple of questions. We've covered three really interesting topics there, so there's bound to be questions. Who would like to raise their hand and ask the first question? Yeah, up the back here, please.
Thanks for that presentation, James. I was just interested, I believe social cohesion study uses a panel, and I was wondering if you could describe how you refresh that panel, or the characteristics of that panel, perhaps in terms of, I don't know, participants who are citizens or usual residents of Australia, ethnic makeup, etc.
Thanks, Catherine. Great question. So the surveys run on the Social Research Centre's Life in Australia panel. They set this up in 2018. It's been growing over time. There's now over 10,000 people on the panel, up from sort of 5,000 or 6,000 over the last couple of years. So it's been doing really well in capturing people new to Australia, partly because it has been growing so much. It's designed to be nationally representative. And it does reasonably well on that, so 30% of panellists are born overseas, for example, matching the figures for the Australian population. But it is only done in English, and so that's where some of the Boost surveys come in, to try and make sure that we're still able to capture people coming from non-English speaking backgrounds as well.
Okay, I think our next speaker is here, so sorry that we've run out of time, but please reach out to my colleagues over lunch, or reach out to them via email if you've got other questions, and please join with me in thanking them for their presentations today. And with that, I'll pass back to Alan. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Justin, and thanks to that terrific panel. Really exciting as a migration nerd to see this fascinating data, which is really pushing forward the boundaries of research in so many areas. I promise that we're not far from lunch now, but before we break, it's a real honour for me to introduce a very special guest speaker, the Honourable Matt Thistlethwaite, the Assistant Minister for Immigration. Since 2013, he has been the Federal Member of Parliament for the division of Kingsford Smith. He was formerly a member of the Australian Senate from 2011 to 2013, during which time he served as Parliamentary Secretary for the Pacific, and Parliamentary Secretary for Multicultural Affairs, and Parliamentary Secretary for Infrastructure and Transport. He's a former lawyer and trade union official across a range of industries, and served as General Secretary of the New South Wales Labor from 2008 to 2010. Assistant Minister, we're conscious that this must be one of your first speeches in the new portfolio, and we're very honoured to have you with us for that. Thank you very much for travelling to be with us today, and the podium is yours.
Thanks, Alan. Good morning, everyone. I acknowledge that this is Ngunnawal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I understand that Paul Howes welcomed you this morning, so I acknowledge Paul and his elders. I also want to thank Alan and the team here at the ANU Migration Hub for once again hosting this very, very important event, an annual coming together of some of the best minds in our nation and indeed internationally when it comes to migration policy. And certainly the theme of your conference today is quite topical and quite important at the moment, particularly around countering myths associated with migration. If you look at Australian society and you pictured it as a dissection of sedimentary rock, what you'd find in Australia is a solid foundation based on First Nations culture and heritage going back tens of thousands of years. On top of that layer, you'd see a layer of colonisation that gave Australia its democratic institutions and many of the values of our society. Then on top of that layer, you would see multiple layers of migration and multiculturalism. All three of those principal layers making up the great fabric of Australian society. And the economic and social success of Australia has been built on migration. We are one of the world's most successful multicultural nation. In the wake of World War II, our leaders and planners saw the need to literally populate or perish. And because of that shift in policy at the time, we are a much better nation. We've been relatively successful when it comes to managing migration and ensure that new migrants fully integrate into Australian society and have fulfilling and rewarding lives. It's been better for our economy. The size of the Australian economy has grown because of migration. Australians have greater average incomes because of migration. We have better living standards because of migration. Our economy is much more diversified because of migration. And importantly, we have a much more culturally diverse society with an enrichment through different foods, through arts, and through business and trade links. We are fundamentally a better nation because of migration. But maintaining public support for migration has always been a difficult and challenging balancing act. And history is littered with occasions where population and populism has seen people and groups turn on migrants as scapegoats. And that tends to, unfortunately, increase during times of tough economic conditions. And a lot of that process and turning on migrants is based on misinformation and myths. Misinformation and disinformation thrives in an information vacuum. Look at how quickly social media streams can be flooded with conspiracy theories. And it happened recently in the UK, literally within seconds. We saw riots sparked, all based on mistruths spread over social media. Similarly, there's been tension here in Australia around our own multicultural communities associated with events in the Middle East. Uninformed or malicious intent combined with the immediacy of social media makes for a potent, unstable and highly combustible mix. And so social cohesion is vitally important to the success of multiculturalism, and preserving and building on the great benefits of multiculturalism in Australia is an important role for government. So how does a government explain to the nation of citizens the benefits of maintaining a migration policy, the benefits of maintaining support for migration, particularly in a difficult economic environment? Well, we think it's important as a government that the nation has a migration strategy, a clear outline of a purpose for migration in our nation, what the goals of our migration policies should be, and what are the outcomes that we as a nation seek to achieve from migration. It's impossible to tell the story of Australia, modern Australia, without talking about migration. More than half of Australia's citizens were born overseas or have one parent that was born overseas. New Australians have come here from almost every part of the world. And together we've got more than 300 different ancestries that we recognised at the last census. We are a strong migrant nation, and together we've built a more prosperous, safe, cohesive country where Australians should feel proud of the system that we've built. And they should feel confident that that system is able to tackle the challenges ahead and to help develop our nation's economy and our society through a clearly enunciated strategy to achieve those goals. When we came to government, we sought to review Australia's migration settings, and we asked Martin Parkinson to conduct that review, to consult with the Australian people, to consult with advocates and interest groups who work in this area, and to advise the government about a new strategy for migration in Australia. And the Parkinson review found that our migration system was broken and that it lacked purpose. The review, led by Dr. Parkinson, found that the system was so badly broken it required a 10-year rebuild. It found that the system had a number of inefficiencies and iniquities that meant that it was failing on many fronts, especially in terms of getting the right people with the right skills into Australia in a reasonable time frame, as well as ensuring that we meet our international commitments. Now, we do have a strategy in the wake of the Parkinson review, and that strategy has 5 key objectives that we seek to achieve through migration in Australia. Firstly, raising living standards for Australians by boosting productivity, meeting skills shortages and supporting exports. Secondly, ensuring a fair go in workplaces by complementing the jobs, wages and conditions of all workers and preventing migrant worker exploitation. Thirdly, building stronger Australian communities by better planning the migration intake and giving migrants the opportunity to invest in their lives in Australia through permanent residence and citizenship. Fourthly, strengthening international relationships by building stronger economic and social connections, particularly within our region and with our international partners. And finally, making the system work by being fast, efficient and fair for migrants and employers. So they're the purposes and goals of our migration strategy. It's about ensuring that we have the skills that we need to meet the challenges of the future, whilst maintaining our humanitarian commitments internationally, and ultimately making sure that newly arrived migrants can successfully settle in our country and have rewarding and fulfilling lives. So our mission is clear: to build a migration system that earns the trust and confidence of all Australians and secures a safe and prosperous future for every Australian. There's a big focus on skilled migration in the strategy, because we all know in the wake of the COVID pandemic, we've had supply chain shortages in Australia, we've had massive skill shortages in a number of industries, and the demographics of Australia indicate that we have an ageing population with a bigger impost coming on our healthcare system, our aged care system, and our National Disability Insurance Scheme. So we need to be not only training the Australians to have these roles in the future, but ensuring that we can encourage skilled migrants to come to Australia where appropriate. And the key actions that we're seeking to undertake, both in terms of temporary skilled and more permanent skilled migration pathways, is to ensure that we have new specialist skills pathways to make it easier for Australian businesses to attract highly skilled workers in industries in demand, for particularly technology and green energy industries. A core skills pathway to meet targeted workforce needs with a simpler, regular, updated occupation list through Jobs and Skills Australia. New visa settings that give migrant workers more mobility in the labour market to help tackle worker exploitation and drive productivity, and streamlined labour market testing and visa processing. So they're the key aims of the skilled migration strategy. And I know that you're going to be discussing a number of issues over the course of today. And we're seeking feedback at the moment. I'm the chair of the Ministerial Advisory Council on Skilled Migration, where we're working with a group of experts, some of you are in this room today, to seek advice about how we can improve skilled migration, particularly when it comes to regional Australia. So if you have feedback, if you have ideas about encouraging and attracting more skilled migrants to our regions, about what we need to do to ensure that those skilled migrants see the regions as a place to call home into the future and are looking at long-term futures in regional Australia, and ensuring that we can get better social cohesiveness and social outcomes for migrants in regional Australia through government support. In terms of our humanitarian commitments, the strategy also acknowledges that Australia has a role in responding to the humanitarian crisis at a time where more than 100 million people are forcibly displaced and more than 2 million people are in urgent need of resettlement worldwide. The government's delivering a humanitarian program that provides refugees with certainty and security as they rebuild their lives here in Australia and contribute to our society. In August last year, the government announced that the number of people being resettled in Australia under the humanitarian program would increase from 17,875 to 20,000 per year, and that's continuing. As conflict and displacement situations around the world increase in scope, scale and complexity, it's critical that Australia continues to demonstrate our support and commitment to international responsibility and to the globally displaced, in line with the objectives of the UNHCR's Global Compact on Refugees. We've been stepping up Australia's engagement and leadership in this area. This includes the Global Refugee Forum and consultations on resettlement and complementary pathways as we work to advance the UNHCR's third country solutions for refugees, the roadmap for 2030. We've just completed our tenure as co-chair of the 2023-24 CRCP, and in line with Australia's broader priorities for the 2023 Global Refugee Forum, our focus during that time was on working with other countries to establish and grow their refugee resettlement programs. We're pleased that the new role that Australia has had in chairing the Global Task Force on Refugee Labour Mobility from April of this year will be a privilege for the government and will lead work that reflects the Global Refugee Forum's priorities and pledges. Last month I was pleased to speak at Parliament House about a new initiative, the Community Refugee Integration and Settlement Pilot, or CRISP as it's commonly known. Credit where credit's due, this is a policy that was originally initiated by the previous coalition government, but Labor supported it in opposition. And the pilot started in July 2022, with the first refugees settling through CRISP 2 years later in August 2022. Refugees eligible for CRISP are referred to Australia by the UNHCR, have been granted a refugee visa category, are offshore and have no family links in Australia. So it's quite a daunting journey for those newly arrived migrants, both in terms of distance and the complexity and challenges of settling in a new country. Refugees arriving through CRISP have access to the same government services: Medicare, National Disability Insurance Scheme, employment support, the Adult Migrant English Program, and settlement engagement and transition support. However, CRISP participants are helped to settle during their first 12 months by trained and vetted volunteers instead of government-funded service providers. And it's important to note that the migration process doesn't end when those newly arrived refugees land in Australia. In many ways, that's just the beginning of their journey. They have many options for support through those CRISP initiatives. And basically, those volunteers work with those newly arrived refugees and their families to settle them in local communities, to help with some of the things that it's not often easy to get support, particularly when you don't speak the language of your new country. So help with filling out a question on a form, help with attending the local school to talk to the principal about enrolling your kids. These are some of the processes and little things that CRISP does to ensure that migrants can settle in Australia, where they've come as refugees and don't have access to family or other community members to provide them with that initial support. I just want to talk a little bit about the Multicultural Framework Review. The government recently released our response to the Multicultural Framework Review, one of the biggest initiatives in this space and the deepest examination of our policy settings, services and programs in more than a generation. And I spoke earlier about ensuring the trust and confidence of the Australian people in our migration strategy. And this framework is really important to helping ensure that we achieve that trust and confidence in the broader Australian community. I'm sure you're aware that the Multicultural Framework Review Panel provided recommendations for the government, which covered core principles of connection, inclusion, identity and belonging. These will play a fundamental role in helping to prevent discrimination, promote equal opportunities, and provide access to strong public services that will underpin Australia's continued multicultural success. The MFR panel's process was extensive. They consulted more than 1,430 individuals and 750 organisations and community groups in more than 200 events throughout the country. They received 796 submissions in 126 different languages other than English. This was a new and innovative approach to listening and hearing from our highly valued multicultural community. So to complement the government's response to the MFR, we're committing $104 million to projects including the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute into undertaking an annual Multiculturalism in Focus research report, $9.4 million to sustain the Community Liaison Officer network and funding support for increased regional engagement, $7 million for translation services and in-language translation website content, and $85 million to flow directly to communities through modernised multicultural grants programs. These initiatives will provide multicultural communities with more consistent funding and foster more certainty, and enabling organisations in that sector to implement longer-term initiatives for lasting outcomes and, importantly, to build that social cohesion over time. So, thank you for once again hosting this important event, particularly for countering the myths associated with migration, particularly the biggest myth of them all, that immigrants take the jobs of locals. I'm sure there are plenty in this room who could easily disprove that and demonstrate that is simply not true. We want to demonstrate to the people of Australia that we welcome newly arrived migrants to this country, and we hope that they will be safe, they'll be respected, they'll be supported, and they'll be offered every opportunity to realise their potential and to thrive. And we believe that the migration strategy, with its clear purpose, its pathways, its programs, its support and its services, will help us live up to that commitment. The migration strategy is a commitment to restoring faith and support for migration in Australia. And for all Australians, it means a better planned migration system aiming to strengthen the community that we live in and to improve living standards for all Australians. Thanks very much for having me. Cheers.
Well, thank you very much, Assistant Minister, for coming all the way to be here with us today and for those remarks. And as you settle into the portfolio, please remember the faces that you see around the room today. We hope that the networks that you build here will help you to make a success of the role that you've taken on. It's not an easy one. In this room, you have a community of practice of people who care deeply about the issue that you're working on and want to see you succeed in this role. So on behalf of the ANU Migration Hub and our event partners and all who are involved, thank you for being with us here today. We look forward to more engagement in future. If I can just prevail on your generosity for a moment longer, we'd like to have some photos taken with the speakers and the chairs, which will take place upstairs. For our guests, please make your way through to the lunchrooms where lunch will be served. Thanks very much.